Hello everyone, back tuning into today's first video. We're going to have a look at some spring analogues again for today's first video. It's part 2 of the GWV Spring 2018 analogues. Later on today, around lunchtime, maybe a little bit after, we'll have GWV Sunday roundup, and then this evening I suspect we'll have some sort of update. It might be slow watch, it might be an analogues update, but there'll be some sort of update turning up on the channel over the course of this evening. So we'll have more about that at the end of the GWV Sunday roundup, I'm quite sure. But kicking us all off, start off with, is part 2 of our Spring 2018 analogues. So what we're going to do for this particular analogues update is have a look at ENSO and have a look at springs that are relevant to our current ENSO state. Essentially, we're in a weak La Nina, or we have been in a weak La Nina through the winter. That is still ongoing. So we're going to have a look at springs that either went from La Nina to ENSO neutral, and that's a majority of springs that would do that, but have a La Nina before them, or we'll have a look at springs that just continue the La Nina on. And there are a few of those springs that did that as well. So that's what we're going to do for our first update. It's going to be quite a long video, so if you can't watch it all in one go, don't worry. You'll be able to come back to the website and watch it whenever you want, because I'm going to place it later on today on the Spring 2018 updates and forecast page. And there'll be a written summary that goes with the video as well. And that's usually posted up around 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. I tend to be a little bit late, a little bit tardy with that, but I will get it up at some point today. A big thank you to James Ackwill, of course, for supplying us with the analogues. I tasked James with the task of having a look at these ENSO analogues. Trawled through the archives as always, so big thanks to James for coming through for us with these analogues. And without much else left to talk about, let's get on with it. So we're going to begin just explaining about La Nina. So it is this blue area that we see here in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. That's a signature of La Nina. This is from NOAA. This was taken the latest image, actually, from NOAA, which was taken on the 1st of February, on Thursday. So that blue area there that we see through the equatorial Pacific, from Peru to Indonesia, is the signature for La Nina. It's the cold sea surface temperature anomalies bringing about a cold event in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. And this started at the back end of last year. It's run through the winter, and it's still going on now, albeit as a slightly weakening feature. It has been a fairly weak La Nina event in any case. So the question is where we go next, because obviously we've had the La Nina through the winter. We're heading up to spring. The question becomes, where are we going to go as we get into spring? And to answer that, we have to look at some models. So this is the Jamstech IOD, and this is what you tend to expect to happen after an ENSO event, be it La Nina or El Nino. You'll tend to expect to drift back to ENSO neutral. So this is where we are right now with the red line just here. We've got the temperature anomalies on the side and the dates on the bottom. So it tells us that at our lowest point we was around there, around -1 with our temperature anomaly in the central part of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. So fairly weak La Nina, but definite La Nina conditions. It shows that we are drifting slowly back up towards neutral. And this essentially is ENSO neutral here. Anything from minus 0.5 degrees to plus 0.5 degrees. So anything from there is ENSO neutral. Obviously, this would be ENSO neutral on the colder side, and this would be ENSO neutral on the warmer side. But anything between that half a degree above average to half a degree below average is essentially ENSO neutral, and that's where Jamstech is taking things through the spring. This is April just here, and it sees us back into ENSO neutral by then. By the time we get through to the start of the summer, around June, May and June just here, we're heading up towards proper ENSO neutral, which is actually this black line just there. So the Jamstech is seeing a gradual return to ENSO neutral through the spring. But the CFS V2 actually wants to keep La Nina conditions going through the spring. So again, this is the same idea. We've got the temperature anomalies on the side, the dates are on the bottom. Anything from there up to there is ENSO neutral. This is where we are right now, just sort of borderlining between La Nina and ENSO neutral. But actually by April, the ensemble mean, which is this black dash line, is heading back into La Nina territory, albeit it's weak La Nina. But certainly by the spring, CFS wants to have a continuation of La Nina condition. Actually keep that going through to the summer, which is quite unusual. But you will see some analogues that shows that this can happen. You can keep the ENSO event running through the season. I think it's unlikely. I think we'll go back to ENSO neutral. But the CFS, anyway, is suggesting that we'll keep La Nina conditions, albeit very weak La Nina conditions, going through the spring. So the two analogues packages that we've got to look at for this spring, from an ENSO perspective, obviously there's no chance of El Nino in the spring, and there's no chance of a very strong La Nina either. The two ENSO analogues packages we've got to look at either going to be La Nina to ENSO neutral springs or La Nina continuing through the spring. So we'll deal with the analogues that focus on La Nina to ENSO neutral first of all. So our first spring is the spring of 1904. So this spring is following the La Nina event of 1903-1904, going back to ENSO neutral through the spring of 1904. And this looks like a very unsettled spring to start us off. So we've got a deep area of low pressure in the northern Atlantic, and we bring the jet stream through like that. So that looks like a very unsettled, not particularly cold because it's Atlantic driven, but certainly a very unsettled spring in 1904. The spring of 1917 comes up next. This one really unsettled, deep trough of low pressure or below average height, which is extrapolating back to low pressure over the UK. Then we have this very extensive ridge here around Greenland and the North Atlantic. So not only is it unsettled, we're also being placed onto the cold side of the jet as well. With that trough. So it's quite a cold spring, 1917. I think had a very cold April. It's a cold spring. It's also an unsettled spring as well in 1917. 1925 is our next spring. This one, again, we place that deep trough of low pressure over the UK and much of Western Europe. We have got a bit of a blocking signal in the Atlantic, not quite as strong as in 1917, but nevertheless, well, I think it's still a pretty cool spring miss. And the main thing, again, very unsettled. There'd be a lot of wet weather in with that one. Kind of similar for 1934 as well. This spring is again placing this trough of below average heights through the UK, western parts of Europe. The ridge is out in the Atlantic, so again we'd be doing something like that, flowing with the jet stream. It looks like we're on the cold side of the jet there. Quite an unsettled and cold spring in 1934. This one's a bit different. This is 1939. This is a ridge of high pressure that we have here close to the UK and also going up to the north as well. Potentially this is a very pleasant spring, although I suppose it could be quite chilly at times, especially early on if we're bringing in a northeasterly influence. But essentially that's quite a nice looking pattern really for the spring of 1939. I suspect there would have been quite a bit of dry weather in with that, and certainly by May it would be a reasonably warm pattern as well. This one doesn't look too bad either. This is 1943. So remember what we're doing here is we're looking at ENSO neutral springs following on from La Nina. So again, just to recap, the winter of 1942-1943 would have been a La Nina winter, and then we go back to ENSO neutral for the spring itself of 1943. And this looks very nice spring. We've got an area of above average heights. It's in a decent position as well. It's generally centred to our south with low pressure up to the north. We're being placed on the warm side of the jet stream. So I assume that was a very, very nice spring there in 1943. Would have had plenty of warm and dry weather in that particular spring. This one not quite so good. This is 1965. This is quite a cold pattern. It's a fairly cold spring in 1965. So we have a ridge of above average heights around Greenland and Iceland. Also a bit of a ridge down to our southwest, but it's not really doing much for us. And then this deep trough covering most parts of Europe and also out in the Atlantic. So we're doing something a bit like that. We've flown with jet stream, that's a bit wrong. So we'd be doing something a bit like that with the flow and with the jet stream. We're on the cold side of the jet. It's an unsettled and pretty cool spring, to say the least, in 1965, followed by a very dismal summer. This is 1972, and we have an area of above average heights to our north, below average heights in the Atlantic, and also stretching through much of Western Europe. So the flow is going something a bit like that. We are at times on the cool side of jet stream, but I don't think it's an overly cold spring. Generally, it's an Atlantic-driven sort of pattern, but it is an unsettled spring in 1972. 1976 is next. So again, this is ENSO neutral spring following on from the La Nina of 1975, 1976. So this one, below average heights up to the north, but also extending this area of above average heights in from the Atlantic. So this one is placing us on the mild side of the jet stream, and actually there's a lot of dry weather through the spring of 1976. It lays down the groundwork for what's going to happen in the summer. So that was a fairly dry and quite warm spring as well in 1976. And this is another pretty decent spring. This is 1984. So there are some quite good analogues cropping up here in the package for ENSO neutral springs following on from La Nina. This one has an area of high pressure, above average heights, anomalously around and to the north of the UK. Below average heights are down to the south. And I think quite a lot of easterly sort of winds with this, but it was generally quite a pleasant spring in 1984, and reasonably mild as well, I think. So that's a fairly decent spring showing up there. This is 1989. Now, this is quite an interesting spring because the winter, the La Nina winter of 1988-1989 was exceptionally mild. And also what happened that winter is that there was hardly any snow. But it did then go into a cold April. Now, the overall pattern, 500 millibar height anomaly pattern for the spring of 1989 looks like that. It looks a very unsettled spring. Bringing flow and jet stream through, but bear in mind that's a 3-monthly anomaly, and there was a lot of intra-month variation with this spring. So April 1989 was exceptionally unsettled. Oh, it's very unsettled. It was also very cold. It's a very cold month in April 1989. There was a lot of snowfall, especially early on in the month. But May 1989 was a very warm month and generally quite a dry month. Also quite a lot of thunder. At times it got quite hot. So a really odd spring there in 1989 with lots of intra-month variation, and that is that sort of 3-monthly anomaly that you see there is disguising a little bit the intra-month variation that we had in 1989. Next we've got 1996. Now this is a very poor spring. It follows on, of course, from the very unsettled winter pattern and the cold winter that we had in 95-96. So the pattern just continues really with this when we have the above average heights, high pressure to our north, low pressure to our south, and we continue, just as we did through the winter, we continue to bring in lots and lots of cold easterly winds through the spring of 1996. 2001 is next. This is a very unsettled spring in 2001 with below average heights very close to the UK. We've got above average heights to our south and also a blocking signal. This is quite an interesting spring. It has a pretty cold March, and that goes on some degree into April as well of 2001, but by May it turns quite a lot warmer. Then we're up to 2006, and this one has below average heights over and slightly to the east of the country, above average heights to our south and also to our north. There was some quite cold weather through the spring of 2006, especially March and early April, and then it turned unsettled but relatively mild into May before we set up that hot summer of 2006 in June. 2009 turns up next. This is quite a nice spring. It follows the cold winter of 08-09, but the spring of 2009 of 09 has lots of ridging to our south, below average heights to the north, and we're placed on the mild side of the jet. So after a cold first half of February, the pattern flipped a bit. The second half of February, something much milder, and then off and running we went into the spring with a relatively mild spring in 2009. 2012 comes up next, and the 3-monthly anomaly for the spring of 2012 looks like that, with lots of above average heights close to the country. Again, this is disguising a lot of intra-month variation, because March 2012 was a bit of a drought month actually. It was very, very dry and also really quite mild indeed, but April 2012 was very different. It was a cold and wet month, very wet, and at times there was some snow as well. So you do have to have that in the back of your mind with any sort of anomaly that stretches out over any length of period, beyond a month really. You have to be factoring in that what you see is a 3-monthly anomaly averaged, and sometimes in some seasons there will be a lot of variation going on between the 3 months that you're averaging out. And then finally, we come to last year, to 2017. And look at this, very bizarre-looking anomaly for the spring of 2017, with this huge area of above-average heights around sort of Western Europe, and especially focused on the UK. And so we're doing something like that with the flow, with the jet stream, lots of dry and warm weather through the spring of 2017. So there's a lot of variation there between the years, but if we put all of those years together and combine all of them every year, every spring from 1904 down to 2017, this is the all years combined chart that we come out with for these La Nina to ENSO neutral springs. And overall, they do look unsettled. They do look like they're unsettled springs, not overly cold either. We haven't got a few in there that are quite cold springs, but not all that many of them. Generally, it's just a very Atlantic-driven sort of pattern that we see here for these springs. Quite a lot of rain, quite a lot of wet weather, but I do think we have to take into account that within this there are several years that are actually showing lots of above average heights and lots of anticyclonic springs. So I suppose you favour, with these La Nina to neutral springs, you favour an unsettled spring, but it certainly isn't guaranteed that you will get an unsettled spring. James has also looked at La Ninas that are quite weak, because of course that's relevant to our current La Nina state. It's been a weak La Nina that we've had through this winter. So these are the all years combined charts, all years combined chart just for weak La Ninas, taking out the stronger La Ninas, such as, for example, the La Nina of 1988-1989. That's a very strong La Nina. So that's taken out of this Analogues package. James took that away. And these are just the springs following weak La Ninas, ENSO neutral springs. A little bit more of a blocking signal with this one. We have more in way of above average heights to the north, and more in way of below average heights to the south. So they're slightly colder, slightly at the colder end of things with these springs, a little bit interestingly. But again, I think it is a bit inconclusive because there is a lot of years that are varying in their patterns here. For example, we've got that very cold spring of 1996, but they've also got 2009, which was really quite a mild spring. We've got 2012, which had that very warm and dry March, but also had that very cold and wet April. Got 2001, 2006. There might be a bit of a pattern there, perhaps if you was able to go in depth. There might be a bit of a pattern there for cold and wet Aprils, I'm not sure. But anyway, lots of variation between those springs. And then, of course, we've got the springs that just continue La Niña throughout. So they start off as La Niña springs, and they're still La Niña springs at the end. So kind of like the La Niña is running through the whole of the year, if you like. And there's fewer of these, but we've got to look at them because that's kind of like what CFS is suggesting. So we start off with the spring of 1909, and excuse me, this one looks like it's a really quite a cold spring. Actually, we've got below average heights to our south. Lots of troughiness there, but notice all of this blocking up to the north. That's a classic Greenland blocking signal that we had there in the spring of 1909. So that looks like it's a cold and potentially quite wintry spring, especially early on. The winter of 1908, 1909 was quite cold. And then we follow that with 1910, interestingly. So we've got two back-to-back springs that are La Niña springs as well. So there must have been a long run of La Niña conditions from sort of the end of the first decade, 20th century, into the second decade of the 20th century. This one looks much better. It has this area of above average heights close to the UK. Below average heights are down to the south. I think overall that's a pretty decent spring that we have there in 1910. Then we go through to 1911. So that's a very strange run, isn't it? 1909, 1910, 1911. Must have been a really long-running La Niña event that went on there. This one has above average heights through the spring, close to the UK to our north, below average heights down to our south, doing something like that with flowing with the jet stream. I suppose it could be quite chilly early on in the spring, but later on probably quite warm. And of course the summer of 1911 was very hot summer as well. Now we've gone on much further into 20th century, so we've gone on to 1950, and this La Niña spring has above average heights out to our northwest with below average heights to our northeast. So it looks like it's quite a cold spring, this one with the flow and the jet stream doing something like that. Probably not overly unsettled, but I think temperatures would be quite cool in that spring of 1950. 1955 is next with above average heights very close to the UK. That looks like it would have been a really good spring. I think there would have been a lot of dry and at times quite warm weather as well through the spring of 1955. 1956 next, so another back-to-back year. This one has above average heights, again, close to the UK. Look at that trough across the northeastern America. It's been very cold spring for them. The flow is doing something like that. So again, a very pleasant spring, I would have thought, in 1956, following on from that freezing cold February of 1956. Our next year is 1971. And so this one, again, looks pretty decent spring, actually, below, above average heights, close to the UK, a little bit to our north, so at times probably pulling in some influence from the north or from the east, but overall, again, a reasonably dry signal, I would have thought, and generally fairly pleasant as well for 1971. 1974 also looks nice, an area of above average heights up to our northeast. That's a little bit more of a blocking signal, so maybe some slightly colder weather at times. But again, I think that's reasonably decent, especially as you get later on into the spring of 1974. 1975 comes next, and this is interesting because we are seeing several years here that are La Niña springs all year, and they're back to back as well. So if you get one it looks like you're likely to get another. So if this spring was to be a La Nina spring, quite unusual to get it, but if we do get a La Nina spring, rather than going back to ENSO neutral, it's not inconceivable that next spring could be a La Nina spring as well, if you see what I mean, because there does look to be a bit of a pattern there emerging. So this one, 1975, quite a cold spring. That has above average heights to our northwest, below average heights to our south. And with this one, we go like that with the flow, with the jet stream. There was quite a bit of cold weather, especially in April 1975, because you know about the snow at the beginning of June. 1985 is next. This is another pretty cold spring. This one has above average heights around Greenland and Iceland, below average heights to our south. And so with the flow, with the jet stream, we'd be doing something rather like that. There was quite a lot of cold weather and unsettled conditions too in the spring of 1985. 1999 comes up next. This is a very odd looking pattern. We have above average heights to our south, to our east, and also going to our northwest as well. And then we have this trough of below average heights close to the UK. Can't remember a great deal about the spring of 1999. I think there was a little bit of a cold snap in April of 1999. Other than that, I think it's relatively warm spring in 1999, to be honest. I don't think there's much in the way of cold weather through that spring, but I suppose it was being quite a dry spring, if anything. Then we've got 2000, so again, that same idea, 2 years running back to back that we have these La Nina springs. This one, 2000, has the above average heights to our north and also to our east as well. So again, quite a bizarre sort of pattern, but again, the spring of 2000 was quite decent to start off with, and then it had quite a cold and wet April, and then it got much better in the May of 2000. Then we've got 2008. This is quite a cold and unsettled spring that we have here, with below average heights over and to the east of the UK, above average heights around Greenland and Iceland. This just begins to shift the pattern to something colder after the mild winter of 2007-2008. The spring of 2008 starts mild at the beginning of March, then around Easter, which occurred very, very early 2008. I think it occurred around the 21st of March, something like that. It's really early Easter, and it became much colder during that Easter, and then we went into quite a cold spell through the second half of March and into April of 2008. However, it then went to a very warm May, and summer in 2008 actually happened in May, because the summer itself was really, really poor, but we did manage to pull off quite a hot May in 2008. And then I think finally for our analogues, we've got 2011, which had a continuation of the 2010-2011 La Nina through that spring. This spring is very anticyclonic, lots of high pressure, and on the warm side of the jet stream as well, it had an exceptionally warm, I think it's still a record. It had an exceptionally warm April. We didn't think at the time that April 2007 would be beaten for a very long time, and then we did it again with 2011. In fact, it was even hotter, very, very hot month indeed in April 2011. That was summer, because the summer months themselves in 2011 actually very poor. If we combine all of those La Nina springs, this is the analogue that we come out with. Overall, it's quite an anticyclonic signal, so a little bit different compared to those La Nina to ENSO neutral springs. This one has quite a high pressure dominated signal, generally close to Iceland, below average heights to our south. And I think really it's about 50-50 whether these are going to be warm springs or whether they're going to be cold springs. So it's a relatively dry signal for the spring if you get La Nina continuing throughout the spring, but the critical factor is exactly where the ridge is going to be sitting. It can sometimes be in a position to bring cold conditions, but also there are several springs there that are really quite pleasant and warm. If we just have a look at weak La Nina, however, and this is more interesting again, aren't many of these springs at all. We've only got 1909, 1911, 1955, 1975 and 1985. So not many weak La Ninas continue as weak La Ninas through the spring, but those that do, again, anticyclonic signal, but this time it's closer to Greenland. The trough is deeper to our south and to our east as well. And so we probably, with these springs, have a little bit more of a northerly or easterly influence. So these could favour a little bit more being on the colder side of things. Rather inconclusive again. Now, we're going to have to combine these ENSO analogues to the analogues that we did a couple of weeks ago where we looked at solar activity. We'll put it all together. Those were rather inconclusive as well, I seem to remember. These are quite inconclusive, but we'll put them together and eventually, I think it'll be around the 25th of February, so not all that long to go now, actually, but around the 25th of February, final Sunday of February, we're going to put it all together with the season models as well. I'm going to try and come up with a spring forecast. I am struggling a little bit from the analogues because they are really quite inconclusive this time. So, that's your part 2 of our spring 2018 analogues. I think we've got one more batch of analogues to look at. That'll be in a couple of weeks' time. Next Sunday, we're doing Solar Sunday, quite interesting. That'll be our first Solar Sunday since August. Then the Sunday after that, I think we're going to have a final batch of analogues. And then it's a case of the following week, final Sunday of February, it's a case of putting it all together and releasing the GWV.com Spring 2018 forecast. Right, so this video will be placed on the Spring 2018 Updates and Forecast page with a written summary, just going over everything that we've discussed. That'll be coming up later on today, probably this evening. Before that, we've got the GWV Sunday Roundup. That'll be released around just after lunchtime. And then this evening, there'll be some sort of update. It might be Slow Watch, it might be an Analogues update. But something will be happening at the website with another video, third video, this evening. But it's just gone half an hour. That's all for now, and thanks for watching.